powerful earthquake has struck northeastern Japan.
That destroyed communities in seconds. As many as 1,000 homes burned.
Everywhere we look, things appear to be coming apart at the seams. Political tensions, civil upheaval, natural disasters, concern over governmental powers restricting personal freedoms. Every human effort that has ever been attempted at making a utopian society has ultimately failed, and now it appears as though we are on the verge of repeating that same course again. Is all of this pointing to something bigger? If so, then what? In a time of uncertainty, we can look to the Bible for answers. Join us now, as in the Scriptures, in association with the ministry It Is Written, as we bring you the series Revelation Today, The Great Reset, coming to you from Murphy, North Carolina. How many of you have ever seen the movie or read the book, The Day the Earth Stood Still? Does anybody else know what that's about? Most of you, if you don't know, you're really not missing much. But it's a movie about an alien craft that comes and lands on Earth. And of course, the whole premise to the story is that this alien being comes off the ship, and he's here to see how humanity has progressed. And if we haven't kind of reached a certain level of humanity, then it's curtains for everybody, start all over. Okay? And so it's one of these things where suddenly all these nations have taken their petty differences, set them aside, and say, oh my goodness, this is it for all of us if we don't measure up. So therefore, it's the day that the earth stood still. There was a point in time where people just had to look at what was happening, and they were in a position where they had to look at themselves and make some dramatic changes. So I have a question for you. If you were God, we have a whole bunch of ways that we commemorate things. How would you commemorate something? If you were God and you had the ability to commemorate something, how would you do it? Now, there are some examples that we can look at in the Bible of how God has commemorated things. Commemorating what was yet to come, commemorating what has been done, and still is what yet to come. And we'll touch on some of those as we go. But, throughout Christianity, there are all kinds of issues where we enter into discussions, debates about what sort of things Christians should observe. There are some sects of Christianity that have so many religious holidays that you almost can't get a single week to go by without some kind of a holiday. The big one for many Christians is Easter. Observance of the resurrection. Now, it's debatable about the history of Easter, and I'm not going to get into any of those details right now because we would be here all night just on that alone. But then there's a big one also is the holiday of Christmas. And again, there's all kinds of varying ideas of whether or not Christians should even observe these things, the roots of where they come from, and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that really, if you really get down to it, if there's any point in time where people seem to be a little more joyous, a little more lighthearted, Christians should latch on to that because there's always room for a little more lightheartedness. And anytime people are turning their minds and thoughts toward Christ, Christians should latch on to that too. But God has this way of commemorating certain things. And we're going to look at some of that tonight. We're going to look first at a passage of Scripture that we've looked at a couple of times already. Now, this passage that we're going to look at, I've even mentioned that there's a lot that can be pulled from it. That's why we keep looking back on this particular passage, because there's so much that can be extracted from it. Revelation chapter 14. And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, to every nation, kindred, and tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth, and the sea, and the fountains of water. So first of all, we see that this angel, again, as this has been pointed out, it's the everlasting gospel that this angel is proclaiming. It is a final gospel message for you and for me. It is a message that is going out to the entire world, and it is calling for something very specific. It's calling for worship, isn't it? Worship him who made the heavens and the earth and the springs of water. It is something that should be calling our minds back to our Creator. Isn't that kind of the wording that the angel uses? Worship him who did what? Made the heaven, the earth, the sea, the fountains of water. It points to God as our Creator. There are two things in the Bible that really lock us into this idea of God being God. Two things that he says. One is, remember the story of Job. There was this whole issue through getting through the story, and it finally gets down towards the end of the book of Job, and God is the one who starts asking some questions. Where were you when I did this? When I commanded for this to come forth, where were you? Okay, in other words, the creation story. Who are we to question God? He's the one who created everything. But there's also what we find in Isaiah where God says that I declare the end from the beginning. I am God and there is no other. I am God, there is none like me. Declaring the end from the beginning. So there's two things that are contained in the Bible that point us to being God as who God is. A is creation, and the theological term is creation ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. So he didn't just take what was already there and just kind of reform it. He took what wasn't there and made something there. And then there is prophecy, Bible prophecy, an accurate prediction or proclamation of what is to come. Not a determination of what is to come, but a proclamation of what is to come. An example that I've used in the past about this, because this is a term that sometimes gets confused, is this whole idea that God has predetermined, or should I say preordained, all the things that should happen. But that's not actually what we see happening. Rather, God is simply stating ahead of time what would happen. So a simple example is this. I have a trampoline at my place, and my son loves to go jump on it. In fact, all three of my children love to jump on it. And there are times, especially when the littlest one, they start getting a little bit close to the trampoline's edge, right? So I'm there, I'm saying, Seth, come away from the edge a little bit. I don't mind you jumping on the trampoline, but do it more in the middle, because there's a lot less chance of you going over the edge. Okay? But if I see him consistently going toward the edge, it doesn't take a prophet to recognize what the potential hazard is. He jumps one bit the wrong way, and over the edge he goes, and he lands on his head, and next thing you know, I'm going to the hospital. It doesn't take a prophet to predict things like that. It only takes an observing eye. There are people who looked at Nostradamus, and they claim that he was some great prophet. Any predictions he made were minimal in the actual number of percentages of the predictions that he made. But aside from that, he was a very intelligent man. And any intelligent individual can kind of look at the progression of life and kind of just throw out some ideas of where these things could end up being. And all of us could get right at least part of the time. Okay? Now, none of us have seen the Jetsons yet with cars that float across the road. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if things continue progressing the way they do, that doesn't really seem too far away, does it? Because technological advancements go by leaps and bounds. Every single one of us that have smartphones in our pocket, unless you bought it yesterday, it's already obsolete because things progress at such rapid paces. But here we have this call that is a call to worship the God who has made heaven and earth. He is the creator. He is also the recreator. And we have this statement here from Isaiah chapter 14. Remember that call back in Revelation was for worship. So what is this statement here in Revelation 14? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. Remember, this statement is about Lucifer. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation. In the sides of the north, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. So one of the things that we see that Lucifer coveted was worship. He wanted to be worshiped. He wanted what was only justly due to God, right? Only God is worthy of being worshiped. But Lucifer said, no, I want to be worshiped too. Now, one of the things that we can see is that when we talk about this whole idea of God as the creator, I'm going to kind of expand this a little bit, and maybe you're very familiar with what I'm about to share, and for some, maybe it's a little bit something new to hear. But when we look at the creation story, there's the way that it's phrased, the wording, in the Bible, in the original languages, there's more than one word for God. There's Yahweh, there's Elohim, there's these different gods, El Gabor, and so there's all these different words. In the very beginning of Genesis, the word Elohim is being used, okay? But very shortly, where God starts working into more of a relational aspect with humanity. The word Yahweh is used. That's the covenant name of God. They're all just simply translated God, okay? But then, as the story progresses, this very same God who did all this stuff at creation is the very same God who led the nation of Israel out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, through the land of into the land of Canaan, through the wilderness experience. But then when we get to the New Testament, Paul basically says all of that was Jesus. Okay, the whole time that was all Christ who was doing that stuff. And not only that, but John has something to say about this as well. And I'm going to, before I get into this passage from John, what it is that it ended up happening is it's absolutely incredible how quickly it takes for things to change on a conceptual level. So when you have Christ, he's crucified on the cross, and the resurrection, the final ascension, you have the life of the apostles, they go out, they spread this message. Within just a few decades, they're all gone. They've all been put to death. John is the last one who was alive. In the time that all those apostles, aside from John, have passed away, there starts to creep up into Christianity something called Gnosticism. Now, that's maybe a word you've heard before, maybe it isn't, but Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge, to know something. And the whole premise to it, and there's a lot of them, was this idea that you can achieve knowing God through special knowledge. Okay? That's the whole concept of Gnosticism. That's why it's called the way of knowledge. It's this special knowledge that only God can give, and this is how we can reach divinity. Okay, now a part of Gnosticism is this concept that God is so high and so holy that he cannot in any way commune with mankind on any level. If he did, we would explode because of his highness and his holiness. So, what God had to do was create a slightly lesser, slightly less divine, less holy God. And then another less holy, slightly more less divine. And step down, 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 until you get removed far enough from the complete total highness and holiness of God that you can actually have something that's still kind of holy, still kind of divine, but can also commune with mankind. Hence, Jesus. Okay? But John, he's aware of these arguments, very aware of these arguments. So what he does is he opens his gospel with a clenched fist and he punches this idea square in the chops by saying this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And if we continue on down to the 14th verse of this chapter, we find what? And the Word became flesh. Okay? So John is taking this statement. In fact, it's the poetic nature of the way this first chapter of John is written. It was written by somebody who was an expert in the Greek language because they could take a very complex language and simplify it into a very beautiful expression that he uses. And it's very deliberately constructed. Basically what John is saying in this opening chapter is Jesus is God. He's the one who, when God said, "Let us," that was Christ who was doing it all the time. So there wasn't this one God and then a whole bunch of other lesser gods and then Jesus is beneath them. He's trying to eradicate that whole idea. And this is something that John kind of hits on throughout his gospel because there are several aspects of this whole Gnosticism that he addresses as he goes. But John is coming right out of the gate saying Jesus is the creator. He is the one who made all things. Now, as we progress, when we get into things like looking at Sir Charles Darwin, who sailed on the HMS Beagle, his sailings were in the first part of the 1830s. And of course, when he finished this, he wrote his book on the origin of species. And over time, that has taken root as the common manner of thinking. He wasn't the first person to promote these kinds of ideas, though. If you look at the literature of the time, there's other people. Charles Lyell was another person who had written some stuff. And you just look at the way they word their sentences. I think most people just didn't want to look dumb and admit that they didn't understand what these people were saying, and they just kind of read these books and said, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But if you actually read some of that material, you'd think that this is some of the most convoluted logic possible to reach these conclusions. But Darwin was somebody who took this idea of what we can refer to as a macro evolution. In other words, given enough time, a cat will become a horse. Okay, over so many generations and over so much development and the changes of environment and so on, or a dolphin will become a cow, okay, if you give it enough time and change to take place. But Darwin was somebody who essentially promoted this idea, and really what I think he was observing is what we can refer to as a microevolution, which is really more adaptation. Things changing to their environments because of environmental shifts, which is why it is that, like the little finches, have you ever heard of Darwin's finches? These little birds there on the Galapagos Islands that, depending on the time of the year, the thickness of their beak gets thicker or thinner, and it correlates to the seeds that they eat, because the husk on the seed is thicker at one point in the year and it's thinner at another point in the year. So when the shell of the seed is thicker, the bird needs a thicker beak. When it's thinner, the bird needs a thinner beak. And so they just simply adapt to these environmental shifts. That's called microevolution. But he took it to say, see, millions of years in order for this to happen. But when we continue looking, we see that these are ideas that are absolutely dangerous to the fundamental way of thinking. First of all, Darwin also promoted the idea that certain races are favored over others. Now, I've brought this up before as for why it is that people aren't trying to cancel out Darwinian evolution, because essentially what he's saying is that there are certain races that are better than others. He was a racist, plain and simple. But it also promotes a lot of very bad ideas. In fact, how many of you remember the school shooting in Columbine a number of years ago? They tracked down the various children who committed that crime, and they found things that they had written. And there's one of them who shot one of the students, one of the kids who died in the shooting, and he's mentioning this kid by name, and he's even saying that he doesn't deserve the nose that evolution gave him. Okay? So they had their heads jam-packed full of this whole idea that ultimately, when you think about it, if Darwinian evolution matters, then there's a big question in humanity that cannot be answered, and that is, what is the purpose of life? Because if Darwinian evolution is true, you and I are absolutely nothing more than an accident. So there is no answer to that question. There is no purpose to life. So if your whole pre-programming into existence is that life has no real meaning, especially if you're somebody who isn't happy with your life circumstances, then what kind of direction can you see your life heading in? But if there is purpose to your life, then now all of a sudden the direction you can take changes, and it actually means something. When we look at Revelation, we see something very magnificent that is revealed to us. It reveals a God of love, and it also points to a God who is a creator, a God who created in 6 days. So what are some of those days? First of all, what did God do on the first day? But he created light. Now, it isn't really too hard to come to this conclusion that the Bible starts with light and it ends with light. And there are some who would say, they look at that text in Revelation that says, then there is no need of the sun to give light, for the Lamb is their light. And so therefore they reach the conclusion that there won't be a sun anymore in the new heaven and new earth. That's not what it's saying. It's just saying we don't need the sun as a source of light. Not saying it's going to be eradicated. The sun didn't do anything to make God angry. It's just been out there doing its job this whole time. The issue is the source of light. We won't need the sun for that anymore, because God himself will be our source of light. Which can tell us that here in this first day of creation, that let there be light was actually the presence of God in the region where he was about to form this earth. We move on into the second day, and what is it that God makes? He makes the sky and he forms the sea. We continue moving forward. We get to the third day. He makes dry land come forth and vegetation to grow upon it. After that, he makes the sun and the moon, and he creates these things to start making the cycles of time that we use, a year, a month, and so on and so forth. Beyond that, on the fifth day of creation, he creates the sea creatures and the birds and tells them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And then on the sixth day, what does he make but to animals and human people? And of course, humanity, or at least Adam, had a part to play in the creation, in that what did God do as he made the animals? But he brought them to Adam to see what it is that Adam would name them. And then whatever it is that he named them, that is what it would be. Can you imagine here this whole issue with Satan seeing the new kid on the block who has just been brought to life, He gets a part to play in the creation, but Lucifer doesn't. Can you kind of get a sense of why he hates us so much? He, Adam, got to do what Lucifer wanted. After all, doesn't the Bible tell us that Lucifer is the one who is full of wisdom and beauty? Right? He wants to have that position of highness. He wants to be exalted as God is exalted. He wanted to have a part to play in that whole creation process, but he didn't get it. It was given to Adam. So what is it that Satan tries to do now? He knows he's going to be destroyed, so his whole point is to take as many of us with him as possible. And he does that via deception, getting us to have a wrong idea of who God is so that we won't come to him the way that we need to. But then how does that creation week culminate? And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And continuing on, it says, and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, or he made it holy, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. So God set this sign right there in the creation week. Now, of course, earlier I pointed out how he had made the sun and the moon. Now, of course, these are vital things for us. The moon not only affects the tide, but it also affects what? The measurement of a month. We use the sun to give us light and heat and the ultraviolet radiation that we need, but it also tells us what a yearly cycle is. We need all those things also to do what? Do we need any of those to measure a week? What do we use? Are there any external markers for measuring out a 7-day week? There's nothing. We know that a year is measured by the Earth's rotation around the Earth, or the sun, I'm sorry. And then a month is measured by the moon going around the Earth. There's absolutely no external markers that tell us how to measure out a 7-day week. The only thing we have is right here in the Bible. And what is it that God did with this last day of creation? What did he do? He blessed it, he sanctified it, and he also rested. He made it as an eternal sign. We're going to see a text here in just a moment that refers to this Sabbath day as a sign, and we're going to see how it is that God himself refers to this. He took the time at Mount Sinai to write it with his own finger in a table of stone. And he didn't do it just once, he did it twice, because after he wrote it for Moses one time, and Moses went down and he threw the tablets of stone down and they busted, he went back up and God made him a second copy, again the exact same way, with his own finger. He didn't trust Moses to write this at all. It was his own finger that sketched those 10 words into those tables of stone. When he wrote this commandment about the Sabbath, he spoke about it a little bit differently. If we look at the other commandments, what do we see? We see thou shalt or thou shalt not. But how is the Sabbath commandment starts? It doesn't start with a do this or don't do that. It starts with what? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. So when we look at how it is that God writes out this commandment, it's very clear what he is saying. It's not only a break for you as an individual, it's a break for everybody. It's a break for your family. It's a break for your animals. It's a break for those who maybe work for you. It's a time for everybody to rest and to recharge. It's not some heavy, burdensome thing. And what is it that we see there in verse 10? But it says the Sabbath of the Lord your God. It's not ours to do with as we please. It's God's Sabbath. He created back at that creation week before sin ever entered into the world. And he made it available for everyone. It wasn't reserved for just one race of people. It was set aside for everyone. Now, if we think about that, if God is consistent in the way that he deals with things, was thou shalt not kill only reserved for a specific group of people? No, it was not. In fact, that was one of the first commandments broken. Because we see it in the story of Cain and Abel. Shortly after, we're not really told how much time had passed, but shortly after the curse of sin enters this world, one of the very next stories, after they're kicked out of the garden, after they're given coats of skin and so on and so forth, after the curse of sin is pronounced, the story of Cain and Abel is what comes next. And murder is the thing that gets dealt with there. And incidentally, if the 10 Commandments hadn't existed prior to Mount Sinai, then Cain got a raw deal because he got punished for something that wasn't wrong. But if the Ten Commandment law existed prior to it being written down, then we can see how it is that Cain was guilty of murder, can't we? The same could be said for the commandment of thou shalt not commit adultery. The Sabbath was created by God 2,300 years before the existence of any Jewish people on the earth. And what is it that it says? For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. This is why we remember the Sabbath. What does it say here again? Read this with me. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. And what did he do then? He rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, or he made it holy. Can you think about that for just a moment? Time. The one thing we all have in short supply, time. There's actually a portion of time that God made holy. Now, when you look at the things that God has made holy, how in the Bible do we see that they are to be treated? When Moses goes before that burning bush, he goes and he says, I must turn aside to see this thing. And he goes to where that bush is and he hears this voice saying, Moses, take off your sandals, for the ground that you are standing on is holy. What made the ground holy? It was the presence of God that made the ground holy. So what was it that God expected from Moses? To be reverent, respect, all right, to show honor that was due to the God who made it holy. There are, when we look at the implements in the sanctuary, they're referred to as holy. How were they to be treated? With reverence and with respect. The story of Nadab and Abihu. Some of you might remember that story where they took incense and ran into the temple of God, what the Bible calls strange incense or strange fire, and they threw it on the altar of incense, and God burned them to death. Okay? And he even told Aaron, do not mourn for them because of how they have treated me. Okay? So when God says that something is holy, he means it, doesn't he? And it's something that we need to treat with the just respect and honor that God deserves. Now, here's that passage from Ezekiel that I had mentioned. Moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between them and me, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. Now, some might say, well, that's for the Jewish people. Okay, that the them there is the Jewish people, that I'm sanctifying them. How many of you here are being sanctified by the Lord God? Is it only Jewish people who can be sanctified? Thank you. I got one person to raise their hand. God is in the work of sanctifying everybody who calls upon him, who's truly seeking to have a relationship with God. That's what sanctification means. It means being set aside for a holy purpose. Now, if you're not being sanctified by God, then you need to question your relationship with God. Because everybody who calls upon the name of God should be looking for that process of sanctification in their heart and in their life. Now, we also have an example that we can go look at it too. What's the best example that we can think of? What is that phrase that people use? What would Jesus do? So, let's ask the question, what did Jesus do? Well, take a look here from the book of Luke. Luke chapter 4, so he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. Now, of course, this particular story here is where he reads from the Isaiah scroll, and he uses this as an opportunity to announce the coming of the messianic ministry in him. Okay, so his baptism had just happened. The whole going off into the wilderness and being tempted by Satan has reached its conclusion, and he comes in, and now he is proclaiming openly that he is the Messiah, and the people didn't really like it very much, did they? What did they try to do to him when he read this? They tried to stone him. They tried to kill him. But he slipped through their hands and was able to get away. But then later in the book of Luke, we have this. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down, and this is Joseph of Arimathea who this is talking about, wrapped it in linen and laid it in a tomb that was hewn out of the rock where no one had been lain before. And when did this happen? That day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew near. And the women who had come with him from Galilee followed after. They observed the tomb and how the body was laying. Then they returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. So we have to ask ourselves, how can we truly know what day the Sabbath is? It really isn't that hard to figure out. God has not made this so complicated that we have to constantly be guessing about this. I know that there are those who try to create this idea that we have the yearly and the monthly cycles, and somehow those change the weekly cycle. Like the first day of the month makes it the first day of the week. So sometimes you can have a week that's 4 days long, and then a new week starts because of where it lands with the month. And none of that is true. The weekly, the monthly, and the yearly cycles all stand independent of each other, and they all just continuing cycling the way God has established them to cycle. So for us to be able to figure out which day is the Sabbath day, which day is the seventh day, is not that hard at all. First of all, this tells us what? That Jesus was crucified on what day did it refer to? The preparation day, which is also what we call Friday, okay? And then it says here that they were laying him in the tomb. Other portions of the Gospels tell us that they wanted to pull him down off the cross so that he wouldn't be there on the Sabbath. John refers to this as a high Sabbath. So let me just touch on that for a moment. What is the high Sabbath? So within the sacrificial system, you had these different festivals that were based on days of the month. It had nothing to do with what day of the week it could fall on. In the exact same way that Christmas is always on December 25th, regardless of what day of the week it might be. So certain days within those festivals were called Sabbaths. Okay? And they were all observed the same. The Sabbaths were all observed exactly the same. But when you have a Sabbath of the sacrificial system that happened to land on the weekly Sabbath, that was called a high Sabbath or a high day. That's where that term comes from. And John is the one who points out that the Sabbath that Jesus was crucified, when he was crucified, he's being laid in the tomb, it was a high Sabbath. It was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because the previous day was the Passover. So he's taken down, he's laid in the tomb, he rests there on the Sabbath, and then the very next verse here in Luke tells us something. Now on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they and certain other women with them came to the tomb bringing spices which they had prepared. So this is not at all hard for us to figure out. How is it that we refer to the crucifixion weekend? We call that Friday, what do we refer to it as? Good Friday, right? Then we call, well, most Christians don't even acknowledge the Sabbath anymore, but then we call the Sunday of the resurrection what? Most people just call it Easter, right? Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but you know the holiday of Easter was observed for hundreds of years before this ever happened, okay? It has its roots in paganism. And really, so does Christmas. They were observed for hundreds of years before any of the stories that were latched onto by the Christian church and dragged into Christianity, because the way that what they wanted to do was to make Christianity more palatable for the pagans during the Dark Ages. That's why they took all these holidays and started naming them with Christian names and giving them Christian observances, so that the people who didn't want to have anything to do with Christ said, oh, hey, okay, well, I guess they're just taking our holidays, so therefore it's more comfortable for us. And that's why you have all these statues who were once named after Jupiter is now called St. Peter. Okay? I'm not going to get on that one for too much right now. But it's not very hard for us to figure out what day the Sabbath is. And I know plenty of people who recognize that the Sabbath is Saturday. It is the seventh day of the week. The question, though, is it relevant? Is it important for us? Well, let's keep going. You can read just about any dictionary, and it will tell you that the first day of the week is Sunday and that the seventh day of the week is Saturday. We can look at languages from around the world, several languages, over 100 languages around the world, where the day for Saturday is a derivative of the word Sabbath. My wife, her first language is Spanish, so they say sábado. You can see up here the word for Saturday in Russian is subota. Okay, these are all, every word that you see up here is a derivative of the word Sabbath that's all used for the words Saturday in all these different languages and many, many others. So astronomers will even tell you that there has never been a break in the weekly continuity. There's never been a break in it. Even the Naval Observatory can recognize that there is no evidence anywhere that the weekly continuity has ever been changed, including changes to calendars. For example, there are arguments that are brought up, well, calendars have been changed, from the Gregorian calendar and all that kind of stuff. And it's true, there have been some changes that are made, but none of them interfered with the weekly cycle. What it changed was the dates, never changed the day. Wednesday was still followed by Thursday. Thursday was still followed by Friday. It was just changed and shifted so that the 10th was followed by the 15th to make up for a gap of time. Those were the calendar changes that were made. None of that ever affected the weekly cycle on any level. And then, of course, we have the words of Christ regarding some of this, too. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Has all been fulfilled yet? Are we still here? Then all has not yet been fulfilled, has it? So when we look at this whole idea, there are some who try to say, well, that word fulfill means to abolish. So let's plug the word abolish in there to the word fulfill. I did not come to destroy, but to abolish. That doesn't really fit very well, does it? Jesus was saying that the law of God is something that would stand. It was so important that God wrote it with his own finger on tables of stone. There's something that he did not want us to forget. They're not called the 10 suggestions, okay? And there are many, many preachers who will say this. What's interesting is that God has even hardwired us in harmony with the 7-day weeks of creation. But did this ever change? Well, let's take a look at a few texts from the book of Acts. Then Paul, as his custom was, sound familiar? Went into them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the scriptures. In Acts chapter 16, and on the Sabbath day he went out of the city to the riverside where prayer was customarily made, and he sat down and spoke to the women who met there. Now, of course, in the context of this passage, he was in a town where there were no synagogues. So there was no kind of house to meet in for the Sabbath. So they went out to the riverside where they had worship and prayer. Acts chapter 13. So when the Jews, listen to this one right here. If there was ever a place where an announcement, a clear and plain announcement for the change in the Sabbath could ever have been made, this would be it right here. Acts chapter 13. So when the Jews went out of the synagogue, the Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. So what is the context of this story? Paul shows up, he proclaims Christ to the Jewish leaders. They say, nope, don't want anything to do with that message, and they leave. But there were others who could hear what Paul was saying, and they said, hey, I want to hear more of this. And then Paul said, well, let's not worry about coming together next Sabbath. We'll get together tomorrow instead. But what is it that Paul says? No, on the next Sabbath, almost the whole city came together to hear the word of God. If there was ever a time, ever, where there could be a clear and bold proclamation that the Sabbath had been changed, this would be it. Because he's not dealing with Jewish people now. He's dealing with who? Gentiles, pagans, people who already came together for worshiping practices on the first day of the week. If he was to change it, this would be it. But there's nothing here that says it, not a peep. What does he do with them, though? Let's come together again next Sabbath, and we will do this. Matthew chapter 24. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babes in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Now, when Jesus is making this statement right here, he is specifically talking, notice the chapter, it's Matthew 24. There's a lot of stuff that we've already looked at in Matthew chapter 24. The wars and rumors of wars and famines and pestilence and earthquakes in diverse places. He's talking about things leading up to, his disciples asked the question, when will these things be, about the destruction of the temple and so on and so forth. And Jesus weaves together two events into this very intricate woven tapestry of imagery, where he's describing not only the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, but he's also talking about what things are going to look like just before he returns as well. He weaves them together. Now, even if we only look at this as being a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, this happened 40 years after Jesus is saying this, and apparently he's thinking that the Sabbath will still be being observed by the people at that time, because he's even talking to his own believers, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. So Jesus, is expecting his followers to continue keeping the Sabbath at that time, isn't he? Or is he saying, don't worry about the Sabbath. Just forget about it. It's all done with now. I know I created it back there at the creation week, and it was fun for me to do it then, and it's been a great ride this time, but out with the old and in with the new. Anything like that anywhere? There are some changes that take place, yes, but what are those changes? In that Old Testament system, we have these ceremonial laws, and we have the sacrifices. These are all things that I've talked about already. But these were the things that were nailed to the cross, what Paul refers to that were contrary to us. Okay? And again, many of them had these ceremonial Sabbaths based on days of the month. But none of them really affect the Sabbath cycle. They have these Sabbaths that were shadows of things to come. All right? And all these words, they should be kind of sending off little bells in our heads of how Paul is using this word shadow, and how it is that they were pointing to things that were yet to come. But when the fulfillment of those things come, you don't need the shadows or the things that point to them anymore. But there is actually something that Jesus had put in place of all these different festivals and holy days that were out there. Can you think of what it was? Is one word that different churches kind of observe it in different ways as far as like when they do it. But it's called communion. The eating, what some churches refer to as the Lord's table, okay? Eating the bread, drinking, some actually use real wine, some just use grape juice. Some churches even do what's called the ordinance of humility at the same time, the foot washing and so on and so forth. But Jesus basically took all those feast days, and because they were pointing to him and his death on the cross and what he would be doing for us, what he is doing for us now, he says, this is what I now want you to observe. Do this in remembrance of me, for as often as you do this, the communion service, the eating of the bread, the drinking of the juice, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. Okay? So he's talking about something that not only points back to what he had done, dying on the cross, but it also points forward to what he's going to do, the second coming. So we don't have to worry about calendars and all of these kinds of observances anymore. What we do is we come together and we observe the Lord's table, and that is how we honor not only the crucifixion, but also the resurrection, and it's a way of looking forward to the second coming. When, though, is the Sabbath to be observed? Well, it's not hard for us to figure that out. Leviticus actually points out pretty clearly, from evening to evening, or from even to even is actually the words that are used in the King James Version. That's simply a phrase that means from the time that the sun goes down to the time that the sun goes down the next day. Okay? Now, that's kind of tricky to figure out some places in the world, especially like in Alaska, where the sun doesn't go down for 6 months at a time, and then it doesn't come up for 6 months at a time. So how exactly do places like that figure out when to observe the Sabbath? Well, those extenuating circumstances are very easy. They usually kind of pick like around about 6 o'clock in the evening and say, okay, well, otherwise they wouldn't have a Sabbath for 6 months. And so they just kind of arbitrarily pick that time that seems to work, and they work with it. But most of us don't have that problem. Biblically speaking, when the sun went down the next day was beginning. Think about the creation story. Every day, what is it first? Evening is always mentioned first. The evening and the morning were the first day. The evening and the morning were the second day, the third day, the fourth day, so on and so forth. When the sun went down, the next day was beginning. So if we were to take kind of how we reckon time, okay, when we think of Wednesday night, okay, biblically speaking, that is Thursday Eve. Have I confused anyone yet? Okay. We really think of it the same way. We call the night before Christmas, what do we call it? Christmas Eve. The night before New Year's, we call what? New Year's Eve. Okay? So when the sun is setting, the new day is beginning. It's the evening portion of the next day. Then the sun rises and you have the daylight portion of the day. Okay? That's how, biblically speaking, it's reckoned. So when we look at certain stories in the Bible, we can see that they're talking about nighttime. It's not talking about like Sunday or Monday night. It's actually talking about the next day when the sun has set, or the previous day, really. And Mark actually fills us in a little bit about this as well, about even to even in Mark 1:32. So we've seen the Sabbath was before Christ. We see that he actually observes a Sabbath in his life, and we also see that he observed it in his death. What did he do after he was taken off the cross? He was in the tomb resting on the Sabbath. And look at this from the book of Isaiah. For as the new heavens and the new earth which I make shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your descendants and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all flesh shall come to worship before me, says the Lord. Now this is very significant. This is telling us that this whole issue of Sabbath will continue to be in the new earth. So if it's something that God created back at the creation story before sin entered the world, it was etched in stone in the Ten Commandments with his own finger, never to be altered, hence it's why it's on stone, and we can see that it will be observed in the new earth. Why shouldn't we be doing it now? Those are some of the great questions that we really need to be asking for ourselves. It's all about time, quality time with God, time with family, time that can be uninterrupted by our regular secular pursuits. It's the one thing we are all in need of is time. Every single one of us has a clock that's going to run out. All of us, for every single one of us, time is a precious commodity. Whether you're young or old, time is a precious commodity because every single one of us doesn't have enough. So God actually took the one thing that governs everything that we know and understand and took a portion of it and blessed it and made it holy and set it aside for a very specific purpose of coming together with him to have a special connection. Now, we see that the Bible is very clear on this whole issue of the fourth commandment. And there are some arguments that make us ask, well, hasn't this changed or hasn't that changed? And we'll touch on those in more detail as we go. But we can see, though, that the fourth commandment, locked right in there in the middle of the Ten Commandments, the one commandment that says remember, the one commandment that points to God as being the sovereign creator of all things, is the very same message that this angel from Revelation is saying, worship the one who made and created. How do we do that? Well, why don't we go back to what it is that God said, this is how you worship me. When we read through the books of Moses, he even says, this is how you worship me. Nothing else will do. Do not turn to the left or to the right. Nothing else will do. We cannot say, I'm going to worship God on my terms. I'm going to do it my way. Every single person in the Bible, whoever said they're going to worship God their way, it did not turn out well in any way, shape, or form. Every single one of them either were killed or had a horrible circumstance that came up as a result of it. James chapter 2 verse 10 says, for whosoever shall keep the whole law and stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. Now, of course, James knew something very specific. He also recognized that the ceremonial system had been set aside. He recognized that fact. We can tell from his writings. He was also right there in the Jerusalem Council and so on and so forth. He recognized that these things were set aside. So when he's referring to the whole law, what's he talking about? He's referring to the Ten Commandments. If you're going to stumble in just one of them, they all are broken. A chain of 10 links is a broken chain if only one link is broken. Okay? That's just simply how it works. And what is it that Jesus also said? But if you, what does it say? love me, keep my commandments. So what is the motivation that we should have for keeping God's commandments, for even trying to keep his Sabbath holy? What should be our motivation? That I can kind of check off a box and earn points with God, and therefore then stand before his throne and say, you owe me for keeping your Sabbath holy. I have earned my right to be here. The motivation is love for God. A love that has shown that he loves you enough to give you something far more valuable than his Sabbath. He gave his life. It's a small thing to say, you know what? I think I can honor your Sabbath in return. There's a story of a man back in 1975 who worked in a Fiat auto manufacturer in Italy. And on his way home, there was this little market, and he would stop from time to time. And he found these two paintings. This market, incidentally, you know, when police would do raids and they would kind of confiscate stuff, they would take and sell these things at these markets. Okay, and they still kind of do that kind of thing today. There are auctions that police will have when they confiscate goods and sell off stuff to kind of help pay for their operations for some of these things. Well, at this particular auction, or this particular market, this guy found these two paintings right here. And he asked how much they were, and the guy who was selling was, they're worthless. They're nothing. They're junk. So he looked at him. He thought, you know what? They'll look good in my kitchen. I like them, so I'll buy them. He paid $30 for them. Okay, took them home. They hung in his kitchen for years. Well, after some time, he had a son who ended up going to college, and he was earning a degree in art appreciation. And he came home one day and he saw those paintings, and as he's looking at them, observing them, he realized that these were originals from a French artist, and they ended up being worth $50 million. Okay? They had been sitting there over his table this whole time, never knowing what their value was, never truly appreciating what their value was. Now all of a sudden they became really significant, didn't they? God's Sabbath has been sitting there for most of us, with none of us hardly recognizing its value. But that doesn't mean that the value is diminished. It means we're missing out on its value. That's what it means. So what is it that we should do in response? Jesus, what is it that he says? If you love me, keep my commandments. Come unto me, and I will give you rest. And what is the Sabbath all about? Rest. Taking a breath, taking a rest, and spending that time in communion with God, with family, with friends, and those who are fellow believers, strengthening your relationship with God and building your community of believers as well. This is why God has given us his Sabbath, because he says, I want time with you. Time that he is the one that set aside. Time that he blessed, that he made holy, and that he set aside for us to spend time with him. But my question for you is this. After we've looked at the texts that we have looked at, do you want to take that time and say, you know what? I want to observe God's Sabbath. I want to remember it, to keep it holy like God said to do. If that's your desire, then I'm going to ask you to stand with me tonight and say, you know what? This is something that I see in the scriptures. It's something that I see in God's word, and it's something that I want to have a part of my life. And I want to make a commitment to God tonight to honor all of his 10 commandments.